Hello, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be here. There we go. So we're going to talk about the future of gaming. Just to get a pulse on the room, raise your hand if you are already in the video games industry. Okay, awesome. It's about half. How many of you have played VR before? Well, even more. Awesome. Okay. So my name's Alek. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sin Studio. We're an XR company based here in Toronto, and like the previous slide said, the creators of the award-winning and best-selling game, VR game, Swordsman. I'm going to brag a little bit when we talk about me and the company, just to build rapport, but I'm really excited about this topic. So to be fully transparent, CEO of Sin Studio is actually my first job in the video games industry. Before we started this company 7 years ago, I did a lot of work in VFX and animation. I went to film school, I studied music and design, but I've always loved video games. And when VR started becoming a thing in the mid-2010s, I saw it as a way for me to get into the video games industry. At the time, nobody knew what they were doing. I could learn and make mistakes alongside everybody else, and there were no AAA studios to overshadow us. And so that was a really good time for us to get started. We co-founded in 2017. I co-founded it with my two childhood friends. And basically, I locked myself in a room for over 3 years, learning to program and to use the Unreal Engine. In that time, we shipped 4 games. The first 3 were explorations into what made for good VR. And the 4th was the product of our findings, Swordsman. We started with $10,000 of our own money in 2017, in the early days of VR, and now generate millions of dollars in revenue per year. We grew from a team of 3 to a team of 30, and we did all of this with no outside investment. Today, we specialize actually in real-time VR combat, and just last month, we closed a $2.5 million seed round to develop the first ever real-time PvP sword fighting game. So I want to spend the rest of this talk talking about, well, to give you a glimpse of what we've learned, and a glimpse of the future of gaming and the future of technology. A surprising number of photos of me as a kid growing up in the 90s look like this. But the real reason I brought these, and the reason they're meaningful to me, is because there's something about that version of me that we all share. It's not a love for video games. It's a flaw in human psychology. I remember loving the NES. Does anybody go that far back? A few, yeah. So the NES was awesome. And before the NES, I played on an Atari and a Commodore 64. You had to load a cassette and type commands in a command line to launch games. The NES experience was mind-blowing. But the flaw, or the phenomenon I'm referring to, is that despite our understanding that there's such a thing as a rate of progress, and despite all of us back then knowing that games were getting better and they'd continue to get better, we couldn't possibly imagine how good they could get. The same is true for most things. We're really bad at imagining how good things can get. And in the 90s, we couldn't have imagined Cyberpunk with the photorealistic mod, or Red Dead 2. And to really drive this point home of just how bad we are at imagining how good things can get, I want to show you a quick clip of Bill Gates explaining the internet to Letterman in 1995.
But I think about this, and what about this internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Well, it's become a place where people are publishing information.
Right.
So everybody can have their own homepage, companies are there, the latest information. It's wild what's going on. You can send electronic mail to people. It is the big new thing.
But I can remember a couple of months ago, there was like a big breakthrough announcement that on the internet or on some computer deal, they were going to broadcast a baseball game. You could listen to a baseball game on your computer. And I just thought to myself, does radio ring a bell?
So this sounds crazy today, and I'm sure Letterman would agree. And I don't need to tell you how much the internet has reshaped our world and our day-to-day lives, our moment-to-moment lives. I mean, none of us would be here without the internet. But there is a new big thing, and this kind of brings us to the main topic of this talk, which is XR and VR and MR and AR, spatial computing. What's going on here? Raise your hand if you're confident you can define all of the above. One person, okay. So it's okay, I mean, it's kind of a word salad. I'm gonna quickly define a few of the key ones there. It's probably gonna confuse you even more, and that's okay, because we're gonna circle back right after and take a closer look at what's really going on here. So all these things have one thing in common. It's some wearable technology that delivers information to your eyes. VR is when that information is entirely digital. Your real world is replaced by a virtual one. Most of you have tried VR, so you know what we're talking about. AR is when you're looking at the real world, but you can overlay information on top of it. Snapchat filters are sometimes called AR, but in this context, I mean without the phone screen. 3D information is basically layered on top of the real world, and you're looking at it through translucent optics. MR is pretend AR. It's a VR headset, but you have 2 cameras in front with a depth sensor, and it's recreating a 3D video feed and showing it to your eyes. So you're looking at the real world, but it's a video feed, and this comes with all the limitations of cameras and displays. And then XR. XR is a catch-all term. It just means all the above. Any immersive technology, any spatial computing technology, AR, VR, MR, it's all part of that umbrella. And spatial computing means the same thing. This is a term coined by Apple, and in typical Apple fashion, it's designed to separate them from the rest of the XR industry. It allows them to drive the narrative about the technology, and they can do this without being anchored to any other XR company. So what is going on here? Who's building this technology and why? In the early days of VR, it was primarily Oculus and HTC. Many of you might be familiar with those two. They were building VR video game consoles for enthusiasts with expensive PCs, basically. And today it's a lot more complicated. Spatial apps and games are untethered. You're no longer needing to buy a PC to buy into the experience. We're running games like Assassin's Creed Nexus and Asgard's Wrath 2 on a mobile chipset. And the XR hardware race is just starting to materialize. To justify the tens of billions of dollars that tech companies with meaningful involvement are pouring into this new medium, like Apple and Meta, they realize how valuable human attention is. And it's ultimately propelled by advertising. Simply put, you won't buy something if you don't know it exists, and the people wanting to sell it will pay a lot of money to show it to you. And the most efficient way to deliver large amounts of information to users for most of the waking hours of their day at the lowest cost possible is to digitize their experience of the world itself. The holy grail, just thinking long term, of spatial computing technology is an all-day, all-purpose wearable device that can displace almost every other piece of technology that you use. And over the next decade, this powerful shift towards spatial UX is going to change how we live, work, play. You'll be wearing a comfortable, small form factor spatial device that can do basically everything. Right now, I have access to the entirety of human knowledge at my fingertips, but I'm experiencing it through a 6-inch screen. If I want to watch a movie at home, or if I want a decent movie experience, I have to buy a big, bulky TV and drill holes into my wall. It's barbaric, it's tedious and expensive. And if you think about it, all of these technologies could be displaced by a single device, one that can display apps anywhere around you, and one that can produce high-fidelity displays that you can scale from a 6-inch screen to an IMAX theater. A bit of a side note, and I think right now this is actually crucial, is a lot of the efforts that these spatial computing companies are gearing towards are to reduce hardware costs, and they're doing a lot of this on the software level. So for example, Meta is solving a lot of problems within their software, or within their tech stack on the software side, so that they can reduce the cost of their headsets by reducing the number of cameras they have to put in there, and Apple's doing a lot of the same for their next generation device. Even functional devices that we can't digitize, like a coffee maker that has to make actual coffee, can be redesigned so that all the information that you care about is digital. You don't have to put a screen into it. You can charge people less money for it and just overlay all the things that they care about. And this rapidly approaching spatial ecosystem is more about technology at scale and how it's going to change our day-to-day lives. But within that ecosystem, just like with mobile, is gaming. And gaming too in the spatial future is spatial. Crucially, and I think the reason we need to start thinking about this here in this room is most developers are unprepared. So why should we prepare? Here are just some of the facts. If you're interested in a deeper market dive and to better understand the business opportunities that XR presents, I encourage you to watch my co-founder Almir's talk tomorrow here at 11:40 a.m. It's called XR Unleashed, Navigating an Industry Shift. So Meta alone sells 10 million Quest headsets per year, comparable to the Xbox. VR retention among the 9 to 15 demographic is on par with consoles. Gorilla Tag, developed by one person, generated $100 million last year alone. And this was just on the Quest storefront. The audience is rapidly growing, but there's an undersupply of XR content. And gold standards have not yet been set, so even the smallest of studios, even solo developers, have massive impact. When there's little competition, high payout, and a great industry outlook, early movers tend to maintain their dominance. There will never be a better time for companies looking at XR. And I think this illustrates that really well. You could see hardware unit sales compared between the iPhone and the Meta Quest headset. And you can see when hyper-successful companies emerged within the iPhone ecosystem. Uber in 2009, when there were only 10 million iPhones sold. Supercell, when there were only 21 million iPhones sold. And Instagram, when there were 25. There are more Quest headsets on the market today than there were iPhones when Supercell and Instagram started. So, okay, sooner or later, you're building for a spatial ecosystem. Maybe you're an early mover and you're helping pioneer the technology, or maybe you're doing it because by that point, everyone's doing it. How is building a spatial product different from building a traditional product? These are some of the key areas where your experience with traditional gaming starts to break down. Scale. Players can see your creation at eye level, enabling them to see everything from any angle when it comes to the environment. You're going to have to build for every single possible perspective. Input. Players interact with your spatial app directly. Their body is the input now. And they want to touch everything. They expect some kind of response. So gameplay, this one's probably the most complicated one. By far the most difficult pillar to navigate, I think, if you've never designed a spatial app. It's no longer a predictable sequence of events triggered by some button input. Like in a traditional game, your players are using finger taps, game pads, a mouse and keyboard. More or less, they're using a kind of binary system where they're either inputting or they're not, right? And if the player wants to attack an enemy in a traditional game, they press the attack button. The game will immediately detect this input, pick an animation to play, and then play it. Notably, during the exact same frame, when they press that button, the game knows which animation it's going to play, it knows how long it is, it knows how far it will reach, and it can communicate all of this to other players, to AI opponents. Basically, you're kind of watching a movie play out at that point. And most importantly, it can ensure, in a traditional context, that no other action can take place except for the very specific, carefully predetermined one that you set in place as a developer. In contrast, gameplay in a spatial app involves few to no buttons at all. It's expressed through the motion of 3 points in space, your head and one controller per hand. Suppose your player wants to attack, they have to physically swing their arm. And they can do this from any angle, at any speed. They can change their mind halfway through. They could be lying on the floor, hanging upside down from the ceiling. You just don't know. Your job as a spatial game designer is to deliver an experience that makes your player feel exactly what you want them to feel, even when they're in complete control of it. It's borderline impossible. It's a very difficult task, and that's why I'm really excited about it. So let's take a closer look. Swordsman is a physics-based combat simulator. We developed it because in doing VR for a few years and shipping a few games, we realized that combat games were going to be the most immersive and engaging forms of gameplay in a spatial medium. The action takes place in close proximity. It makes great use of the depth and parallax that XR offers. Melee combat uses your body as the primary input as you engage enemies at close range, and you have to physically perform every action. It's exciting, it's high impact, and it evokes powerful emotions. Now in Swordsman, you're up against AI opponents, it's PvE. So our AI had to somehow deal with anything a player could do with their sword in real time. And there's not enough time here today for me to cover all the clever solutions we came up with to do VR combat well, but I'll focus in on one in particular to just illustrate the complexities of designing for spatial gameplay. One of the most challenging parts of the experience was to have the AI block any attack that you would swing at them with, especially when it could be any swing imaginable. They would have to align their sword in a very particular way at a particular time to intercept it. And I'm oversimplifying here, but the solution in V1 was basically this. We described the sword mathematically as 2 points in space, one at the tip and one at the base of the sword. And we drew a line between them. We tracked each point through time, and then based on things like velocity and acceleration, we predicted where each point would be 10, 20, 30 frames in the future. The relationship between those points gives you a unique variable, angular momentum. And so neither point rotates in space, but the line between them does. And as the player swung their sword around, we actually used the predicted future state of the sword, or the line, to drive an animation blend space in the present. The position and orientation of the line relative to the AI dictated the position and amplitude of the blend. And so as you began to swing, the AI would blend into a specific pose based on where you would be in the future, so that by the time you got there, it would have already arrived. Now, this problem and this solution are very three-dimensional. It's not a problem we have to solve very often in traditional games. Primarily, like I said, because in traditional games, everything's triggered as a sequence of events by a button. And you don't really have to mathematically describe and define those events in real time. In a spatial combat game, there's no such thing as an attack event. You have to mathematically describe what an attack is without breaking player expectation. And most of the problems you'll be faced with as a spatial app designer are about describing the motions of the human body in 3D space, and then using those descriptions to define states and events and things of that nature. And so consider this: if you're swinging a sword in real life, when does the swing begin and when does it end? You might intuit the type of swing that you're performing, but how do you describe it mathematically? So spatial computing is the obvious next step in how we interact with technology. Spatial reasoning is an adaptation hundreds of millions of years old. It's a technology leaning into how we experience the world. And in a way, this talk is a cautionary tale. When we stop doing this, when we stop looking down at our apps and we look up to see them all, the form factor we're building for today, or the form factor we're building for in traditional media, will be a relic of the past. So I encourage you to explore this inevitable but exciting new chapter in computing. And if you're interested in learning about the business opportunities today, like I said, my co-founder Almir's talk is tomorrow at 11:40. Thank you.